Hello, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also looking at their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. Today, we are going to continue the theme that we've been on now for some time on the podcast, and that is Islam's fault line. But we're not going to talk about a particular country today. Actually, today we're going to focus on the thread that binds all of this theme together. What makes these tectonic plates of Islam that rub together and create friction the foundation for the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East and North Africa and the greater Islamic world, actually. And you can't talk about Islam without talking about fundamentalism. It's just not possible. And so today, we are going to look at the origins of Islamic fundamentalism and what it has created in terms of the geopolitical environment throughout the Islamic world. But before we do that, I want to say something. I consider myself to be a tolerant person. I've really had to be because I've worked all over the world with all different types of people, ethnicities, religions, cultures. So I'm pretty flexible and I try to understand people's points of view. And I think if you're a regular listener or viewer of this podcast, you know that I don't go out on rants. That's not what this is about. It's about creating understanding. But one thing that makes me intolerant and downright upset is when a whole people group is put into a particular box. And I think this happens to more than one people group, but certainly it happens to Muslims a great deal. In some people's mind, when you hear the term Muslim, you think of jihad, and that cannot be further from the truth. A huge majority, a huge majority, upwards of 97 to 98% of Muslims, I would say, want the same thing that everybody else wants, and that's peace and safety and economic security. They want to take care of their families, they want to live their lives, they want to have a job. They are not part of jihad. They're not part of this militant fundamentalist movement. They may be conservative in their Islamic beliefs. That's okay. They have the right to be that. They certainly may not believe, even cultural Muslims may not believe the way that those of us who are not Muslims believe. But as I said, a huge majority are not militant in their beliefs. And so to categorize them as that is not only incorrect, it's absolutely wrong. So today, I hopefully will say some things that will help break through that narrative. Because you can't understand the Middle East, or at least a half century of global security, without understanding the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Not Islam, not Muslims, but a specific radical absolutist interpretation that weaponized Islam into ideology and ideology into violence. It didn't begin with 9/11. It didn't begin with ISIS. It didn't even begin with the Afghan jihad. It began with a question that millions of people across the Muslim world were asked by the mid 20th century. Why did we fall behind and how do we rise again? Some answered with nationalism, some with socialism, some with monarchy, and some with a small but growing minority answered with a return to the purest, rigid, uncompromising vision of Islam that rejected modernity, the West, and the secular state. This is a story of how that minority became a global force and how the world responded and what comes next. So let's start at the beginning. What were the roots of Islamic fundamentalism? Well, it starts in colonial times. The 19th and 20th centuries were devastating for the Muslim world. Empires collapsed, European powers carved up territories, traditional institutions weakened. Millions felt humiliated, displaced, and uncertain. Into that vacuum came a longing for certainty and for return to something pure, uncorrupted, and strong. That led to the birth of modern fundamentalism. And within that context, three movements matter the most. Salafism, which was a call to return to the practices of the earliest Muslims. Wahhabism, a puritanical movement rooted in Arabia. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt in 1928, which blended social activism with political Islam. These movements were not inherently violent, but they created the ideological soil from which later extremism would grow. Another tipping point, if you will, for the rise of Islamic fundamentalism was the failure of the secular Arab nationalism. By the 1970s, the promises of Arab nationalism, unity, prosperity, dignity, had collapsed. The defeat in the 1967 war with Israel shattered the confidence in secular leaders. Into that disappointment stepped religious movements offering a different answer. And of course, there was a tipping point. And one of those tipping points, there were a multitude of them in this topic, and one of them certainly was the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which we've talked about on previous episodes. In 1979, Iran overthrew the Shah and established an Islamic Republic. It electrified the region, and suddenly political Islam wasn't just a theory, it was a state. That same year, there was a siege of Mecca. Extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Islam's holiest city of Mecca. The shock forced Saudi Arabia to embrace stricter religious policies, empowering clerics and exporting conservative ideology abroad. Then came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And let me tell you, I saw the outcome of this, or the impact of this on the country and the people, and it was a crucible. The Afghan jihad drew fighters from across the Muslim world. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia supported the resistance. A generation of militants gained training, networks, and a sense of divine victory. And among them was a young Saudi by the name that we've all heard of Osama bin Laden. Global jihad didn't emerge all at once. It emerged gradually, using all of these forces that I've already talked about as its foundation. One of the initial visible elements of this global jihad was the emergence of Al-Qaeda. After the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and others formed Al-Qaeda, a transnational extremist organization responsible for mass violence and human rights abuses. Their ideology was simple and absolutist. The West is at war with Islam, Muslim governments are corrupt, and violence is the only path to change. Al-Qaeda attacked the embassies of the United States in Africa, the USS Cole, and other targets in the 1990s. The world noticed, but it didn't yet understand the scale of what was coming. And the world wouldn't understand it until that fateful day of September 11th, 2001. As you know from previous episodes, I was in Romania at the time, and I can still remember sitting in my office and a staff member coming in and informing me that planes had just hit the World Trade Center. And I remember the hours and the days after that and the angst, not only of me and my family, but of the world. Nothing was the same after that. Because on that day, Al Qaeda carried out the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The world's response reshaped geopolitics. It caused the U.S. to invade Afghanistan. It caused NATO to invoke Article 5. And it led to the rise of counterterrorism as a global priority. In essence, that day, September 11th, 2001, started the war on terror. The war on terror continued in varied forms all the way through 2003, when the U.S. invasion of Iraq toppled Saddam Hussein. But in doing so, it unleashed chaos. The Iraqi state collapsed. Sectarian tensions exploded between the Sunnis and the Shias. Militias formed. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged. And this led to a convergence of other things. This was one of the first dominoes to fall. Because this empowered people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and introduced extreme brutality, mass killing, sectarian attacks, and propaganda. His group was responsible for widespread human rights abuses. And then, of course, there was the Syrian civil war, as we talked about in a previous episode. Syria collapsed in 2011, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq rebranded itself as ISIS and seized territory both in Iraq and Syria. In 2014, it was declared a caliphate. It was a state built on violence, coercion, and terror. Of course, the world had to respond. And certainly the U.S. and the global coalition did that. The U.S. put together a coalition of more than 70 countries to dismantle ISIS. Kurdish forces in Syria and Iraqi forces also played central roles. But at the same time, the United States, Europe, and other areas were having to deal with domestic extremism. For instance, Europe faced ISIS-inspired attacks, radicalization challenges, a refugee crisis, and political polarization. As a matter of fact, one would argue that the very significant refugee situation in Europe now that's tearing apart governments began during this period when refugees were streaming out of areas such as Iraq and Syria, and to a smaller degree Afghanistan, and settling in different countries in Europe. The mistake the Europeans made, of course, which cannot be undone, is that they were loath to prepare for this. And the vetting processes were inconsistent. They were lax. In some cases, didn't exist at all. And these refugees got into Europe. And along with those who were true refugees, who were simply trying to live a better life, came those that were interested in jihad. Of course, This pushback from the West also created a response from the Muslim world. Muslim majority countries condemned extremist groups and they fought them militarily and ideologically. Scholars emphasize that extremist ideology contradicts mainstream Islamic teachings, and this is absolutely the case. But the extremists had some arrows in their quiver as well. They heavily used social media, encrypted messaging, and online propaganda. Of course, governments within the coalition responded with cyber operations, content moderation, and intelligence sharing. This is where a lot of the laws about hate speech began. This is where a lot of the monitoring of internet traffic began. But once again, the world was playing catch up. Of course, while ISIS had its day, there came a point in time when the coalition became too strong. And by 2019, ISIS had lost its territory. But it hadn't lost its ideology. Instead, the extremism shifted to Africa, the Sahel, Nigeria, Somalia, South Asia, and online networks. There were also lone actor attacks, individuals who had been radicalized through ISIS, and when the organization splintered, they became a new threat wherever they were in the world. The battle was not just physical, it was ideological. And as far as the future, that ideological battle continues. We need to understand that extremism thrives where states fail, where economies collapse, where identity is threatened, where corruption is rampant. Look at what happened in Syria. The chaos led to the promulgation of extremist networks. The same thing in Afghanistan. The same thing in Iraq. The same thing to a certain degree in Palestine, especially Gaza. Where there is chaos, there is the opportunity for bad actors to take something that is otherwise pure and noble, whether or not we agree with the philosophy, and turn it into something that is diabolical. Also, terror continues in the form of technology with AI, deepfakes, and encrypted platforms. This is shaping the next phase of extremism, but it's also shaping the next phase of counter extremism. You see, the Middle East is in transition. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others are modernizing, and their ideological landscapes are shifting. But instability in Syria, Yemen, and parts of Africa create openings for extremist groups. The important thing for us to understand, and the point I want to make here that I hope lingers with you, is that extremism is not a wave, it's a cycle. It rises, it adapts, it mutates. The world's response must do the same. If the world continues to play catch up, as it did in the late 90s and the early 2000s, then Islamic extremism will not only grow, it'll be more successful. The battle still goes on. And it's a battle for not just the alleviation of terror, but I would argue it's a battle for the soul of Islam. It's not just a battle against the West and Islam. In fact, it's not a battle at all between Christianity and Islam or the West and the Middle East and North Africa and other Muslim countries. It is a battle for the soul of Islam. It's an internal battle as well as an external one. Because a huge majority of Muslims, as I said, don't want anything to do with extremism. They don't want anything to do with jihad. They simply want to live their lives. And yet, these tectonic plates are crashing together. The fault lines are there, and they have to determine how to address this issue. And when they see the world in their perception turning against them, even when they've done nothing, even when they've tried to minimize extremism, this is not helpful. And it sends the wrong message. So this is not a story about religion. It's a story about power, identity, humiliation, hope, and the human search for the meaning of life during times of upheaval. The world's response has been sometimes wise and sometimes disastrous over the last 50 years. But the next 50 years will depend on whether we learn anything. Because as I said, the battle isn't on the battlefield. It's in the realm of ideas. And ideas, once ignited, don't disappear. They evolve. And I can tell you that even as we speak right now, even as you're listening to this right now, there are those in the Muslim world, leaders in the Muslim world, who are trying to deal with Islamic extremism in any way they can. There are also those within the Islamic world who are trying to continue the jihad, continue the upheaval, continue the collective and lone wolf attacks around the world to create instability. Because instability is their only weapon. Stability is the way to defeat extremism. Economic security, good governance. These are the tools to alleviate extremism. It's instability, it's chaos, it's the inability to have a say in your own governance. It is poverty. These are the things that create the foundation for Islamic fundamentalism. And these are the things that we have to approach as a society. So, in many times, both the Muslim countries and the West are battling symptoms. We're battling the attacks. We're trying to prevent the attacks. And we're not addressing the reason these attacks happen, the reason Islamic fundamentalism was on the rise and took root, the reason it continues to metastasize today in different forms. We have to address the core issue. We have to cure the disease and not just treat the symptoms. And that's what's not happening. It's what hasn't happened. And this is why that in Europe and in Asia and in Africa, and to a lesser degree in the United States, there is still the threat of terror on a daily basis. Because the fundamental question that Muslims asked from the very beginning has still not been answered. And that is, why is the rest of the world moving forward and we're not? In some cases, why are our own governments in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, and UAE, with all the beautiful buildings and the wealth, why is all of this happening, and yet a large swath of people in the Muslim world remain poor, with no voice in their own governance, etc.? If we want to battle Islamic extremism, we have to cure the disease. Something to think about. I didn't try to change your mind today. Whatever your belief is what you believe. But I can tell you, as one who has worked with Muslims on a daily basis, that the attacks that you see on television, the, the jihad, the fundamentalist rantings that have become part of the nightly news process is not Islam. It's not. It is a radical interpretation based out of frustration and hatred and and ethnocentricity that is damaging Islam and it's damaging the world. And so hopefully you will join with me in encouraging those in leadership to treat the disease and stop treating the system, these symptoms. Until next time, I'm Mark McCord. This is Some Stops Along the Way. We'll see you next Monday at 8 a.m. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.